Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Welcome to the second day of our Media Freedom Conference. And I just want to say that we are so proud that we have got together such an extraordinary collection of people to talk about something so important and something that probably many of us have taken for granted one way or another, particularly if you grow up in a country like this, you sort of take these things for granted, and it's reminded us that some things really have to be fought for. So thank you for your commitment, and on behalf of the United Kingdom and our co-host Canada, a very warm welcome. And this morning, of course, we have Chrystia Freeland, who you heard from yesterday, the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Amal Clooney, who you also heard from yesterday, who's my special envoy on media freedom. We've also got Audrey Azoulay, who's the Director General of UNESCO. Very warm welcome to you. She is representing the United Nations Secretary General. And we've got His Excellency Mr. Gobind Singh Deo, the Minister of Communications and Multimedia of Malaysia. You might ask why we've chosen Malaysia. We could have chosen Malaysia or Ethiopia or one or two other countries, but in a world where media freedom is being constrained, there are some amazing examples of countries that have gone in exactly the opposite direction and taken the courageous decision to free up their media. And one of them is Malaysia, so we're absolutely delighted to welcome Gobind here. And we also have Lord Hall, the Director General of the BBC, and we're delighted to have him here on the panel with me, as opposed to the other side of the microphone to me, which is my normal experience with those friendly BBC journalists. So we have over 100 countries represented. We have a gender split of roughly 50-50, but I'm here behind the microphone just to make sure it's not unfair to men. And we've got this morning to focus on the broad question that I was talking about in my speech today as to what constitutes media freedom, why does it matter, and particularly this morning, what are the trade-offs that you have to confront if you are going to protect media freedom, the trade-offs with security, the trade-offs with established diplomatic relationships, the trade-offs with alliances, the trade-offs about what you do in public versus what you do in private. All these are very important things which we want to discuss and air and think about. So it is my great pleasure to start off by inviting the Minister of Communications and Multimedia from Malaysia, His Excellency Gobind Singh Deo, to come to the lectern and tell us about Malaysia's experience. Please come to the lectern.
Your Excellencies and honorable guests, good morning. I am extremely honored to be here today to talk about this topic of great importance, which is media freedom. Thomas Jefferson once said that our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without it being lost. It is interesting that for one of the founding fathers of the United States, born out of a revolution, to so astutely point not to the military might as the true guardian of our society, but instead to the press. The pen is indeed mightier than the sword, but perhaps in the digital era of today, the media is even more powerful than both the pen and the sword put together. In many countries, media freedom is like a bellwether. It acts as a yardstick as to the direction, both political and social, of freedoms and where they're headed. The more the media is restricted from carrying out its responsibilities, the more likely the country is headed towards authoritarianism, and repression. Many may not look to Southeast Asia as being a beacon of media freedom, but I am proud to report to you that Malaysia has bucked that trend after its new government, the Pakatan Harapan coalition, took over in May last year. In line with our election manifesto, we promised more transparency and accountability, and also to repeal oppressive laws which has previously been used to silence the media and, of course, dissenting views. One of the first pledges that we fulfilled was to repeal a controversial Anti-Fake News Act, an act which we found to be a piece of legislation somewhat hastily enacted by the previous government to clamp down on the press, the opposition, and civil society. And even though that bill was defeated in the Senate, the law itself now is no longer in use in Malaysia. While some have called for the re-establishment of this act, the government is firm in supporting its abolishment. Our Prime Minister, Tun Mahathir Mohamad, while acknowledging that the media, particularly social media, can be easily abused and, of course, cause damage to society at large, was quick to nevertheless say, when you have a law to prevent people from airing views, then we are afraid that the government itself may abuse it, as has happened in the past. We do not want any government, whether this or the next one, to abuse such a law. Our efforts to enhance press freedom is bearing fruit. In the RSF Press Freedom Index of 2019, Malaysia moved up a massive 22 notches to be ranked 123rd out of 180 countries listed thereon. The same report also noted that journalists and media outlets in Malaysia have experienced much more freedom in reporting the news and operate in an environment free of harassment. Indeed, a noticeable cry from the old days. To give you some examples of what we have seen under the previous regime, Malaysia is now well known for the 1MDB corruption scandal, and I think all of us read the extent of the problem that it has caused. A whistleblower portal called Sarawak Report, which was run by Claire Newcastle-Brown, was blocked in Malaysia in 2015 because of exposing the 1MDB corruption scandal, which of course involved the previous Prime Minister, Najib Razak. Claire was also banned from entering Malaysia. Online portals such as the Malaysian Insider were blocked in Malaysia in 2015 because of being critical and exposing the corruption scandals, as alluded to here and before. Their editors were also arrested. The Edge newspaper suspended in 2015 because of the same reason. Mary Ann Jolie from Al Jazeera was denied entry into Malaysia because she hosted the September episode of Al Jazeera's 101 East program on the controversial murder of Mongolian model Altantuya Sharibu. In 2016, Linton Besser and cameraman Louis Aroglu from ABC Television's The Four Corners Show were arrested and deported from Malaysia because of asking questions to the Prime Minister with regards to the 1MDB corruption scandal. These are just a few examples that show how it is the previous regime in Malaysia dealt with press freedom. Another important initiative that we have undertaken in this new government is the establishment of a self-regulatory media council, which will be held by the industry itself and designed to govern the conduct and uphold the quality of news reporting, as well as ensuring a responsible and free, vibrant media in Malaysia. The government is in the process of holding consultations and, of course, getting feedback through discussions with all vested interest groups, including media owners, journalists, media organizations, unions, civil society groups, and, of course, this is all towards that process of starting up the Media Council. No doubt, ladies and gentlemen, the Fourth Estate has traditionally acted as a check and balance to the powers of the three other branches of government, the executive, legislature, and judiciary. And it is imperative that they continue to uphold this responsibility. Malaysia, under the new Pakatan Harapan government, is committed to ensuring that it develops a vibrant and free media environment that can only better safeguard our liberties. However, the issue of concern to all of us today is the rapidly changing nature of the press in this digital age of instant news. The rise of news platforms and citizen journalism has made journalism truly mainstream and not within the control of a few. And of course, the speed at which news unfolds today presents new challenges which calls for attention. While giving people a platform to voice their opinions is certainly a positive development, it does come with its fair share of challenges. Some argue that the lines between reality and fiction are becoming blurred in the digital realm. As we grapple with these new challenges, as the prevalence of fake news, half-truths, misinformation and disinformation, we find that there is a need to be more vigilant to deal with these problems. We need to equip ourselves with the tools to sift through the noise, to distinguish fact from fiction, emotion from opinion, and to preserve that essential element of trust and integrity in the new media domain, which will build itself even larger and stronger in the years to come. The dissemination of misinformation and disinformation can cause unease and unrest very quickly if we do not have adequate measures in place. And in some cases, because of the anonymity afforded to users, cyberspace may be increasingly abused to suit the agenda of certain quarters with their vested interests. Far more alarming, false information or unverified news on social media platforms and messenger applications may incite hate, spark racial, even religious or communal tensions, which may result in violence and instability, be it against a particular section of society or otherwise. I am of the opinion that it is against this backdrop and in this context that we need to look at press and media freedom today. We have all heard from the panelists before me about how important a free and independent media is in the struggle to build nations which are transparent and accountable. I agree that there is certainly a need for us to encourage, protect, and defend this. All countries must commit to ensuring that its press is not hunted down nor vilified because its policies or decisions are questioned. Likewise, there must be courage on part of governments to acknowledge those great risks that journalists take when reporting cases which expose powerful organizations, crime, and also tread on issues sensitive in nature. Cases where complaints are made that journalists have been threatened or even assaulted must be properly dealt with. Those responsible must be held accountable, and a strong signal must be sent through such action to society at large that the press should not be ill-treated, but instead respected for doing their jobs. On the 22nd of March this year, a group of reporters covering an event in Kuala Lumpur involving the former Prime Minister, Najib Razak, were assaulted. I issued a statement immediately denouncing the attack as Minister of Communications and Multimedia. And I personally met up with the reporters concerned to express solidarity with them. Charges have been brought against those concerned. But more must be done. In cases where journalists are oppressed, politically imprisoned, assaulted, killed even, collective efforts must be made to address those issues and for those responsible to be held accountable. At the same time, we must also recognize the fact that, like anyone else, journalists and members of the press are not perfect. They too need to ensure that they uphold the highest of ethical standards in the way they report on issues of concern to them. There's a need to ensure that press freedom is looked at from a true and accurate news requirement perspective, to be distinguished from instances which involve publications of falsehoods, misinformation, and even disinformation. This is essential if we are to build reliable journalism which inspires trust, a most important hallmark in the media world of today. It is in this context which we must emphasize and keep emphasizing when we applaud and defend press freedom. The question, ladies and gentlemen, is how do we do this? The Malaysian government has started to take a more holistic approach in addressing the issue through a combination of academic research, citizen engagement, co-regulation, engagement, of course, with media entities and platforms, education, enforcement, and also perhaps legislation. There is also a need, I think, for us to find a structure which involves and includes all sectors to jointly partake in our efforts to deal with fake news and the platforms associated with it, so that the benefits that are derived through independent, accurate, and true journalism are not displaced from its true value. Malaysia, ladies and gentlemen, is continuously looking at measures to strengthen media professionalism and ethical journalism. But at the end of the day, and as I have alluded to earlier, even as we roll out various programs and processes, it is really up to each and every one of us, not just governments or media organizations, but society at large, to make it work. This forum may be an important feature in this all. It may facilitate the exchange of ideas that we need to defend press freedom at a global level, which is necessary today. And with that, I wish to record my gratitude to the organizer and the Canadian and British governments for this opportunity to address all of you, my esteemed fellow ministers and national leaders and media guests at this very important global conference on media freedom. May this meeting be the beginning of that very important journey that we must all take in order to facilitate all that is needed for us to defend press freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gobind. When I was in Malaysia in January, I actually met a cartoonist and blogger who said that he would have been in prison if the government hadn't changed. But when the government changed, all the charges against him were dropped. So I think that is incredibly encouraging. And I think one of the things about a free media, which isn't talked about enough, is the link between peaceful transfer of power and a free media. Because having a free media, first of all, it disincentivizes people who would like to snatch power by force. But secondly, if you win an election with a free media, you have a legitimacy that you don't have if you grab power being able to control the media. And I think it's very important for young democracies. So part of the outcomes of this conference is that the UK, with other governments, are setting up an international task force to help young democracies deliver their commitments on media freedom, including developing national action plans. And because we're not perfect, we are also having our own national action plan in the UK on the safety of journalists. We had the terrible murder of Lyra McKee, which we are still coming to terms with, assisted by a new national committee that we are establishing to advise us how best to do this. So now our next speaker, with great pleasure, is the Director General of UNESCO, representing the UN Secretary General, and she is the guardian of the UN's plan on the safety of journalists. So please give a warm hand for Audrey Azoulay.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Romario da Silva Barros, Muhammad Bilan Khan, Norma Sarabia. These are the names of the 3 journalists who've been murdered in the last 30 days. Names on a long list, with 28 journalists killed since January 1st. Over 850 since 2010, twice as many as in the previous decade. Undoubtedly, the threats to the profession of journalists are not new, but they've taken an unprecedented scope and expression. For it's not only a matter of false accusations, imprisonment, and assassinations, nor is it only a matter of the frightening realization of the impunity, with only 1 in 10 journalist murders prosecuted. Or that in the last 2 years, most of the journalists have been killed in countries that are not at war, very often investigating corruption. But there is also this very contemporary tune, which is discrediting the media. a tune that sometimes echoes even in public speeches at the highest level. One more reason, if we needed one, for this conference. This overall atmosphere can fuel suspicion or even hostility towards journalism in such a way to make another victim the very idea of truth. This idea of truth that Victor Hugo wrote about, and we have his beautiful quote here. It is in this respect that media freedom is so important. Truth is not a public good like any other. Truth requires independence to be produced, developed, guaranteed. It is often complex, hidden from views. It requires expertise, sources, time for verification, analysis. It requires professionals. We know the media are essential to a functioning public sphere, to democratic vitality, and even political pluralism. It stimulates debates while fostering forces that shape society, political, economical, technological, to more accountability. Journalism and the media are essential to peace, sustainable development, human rights for all, as recalled very recently by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. But only 10% of the world's population has access to free press in their country, according to RSF. Dear Christophe. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be with you here today as UNESCO's Director General and also to represent the Secretary General. To be here with you today in the UK, which has put media freedom on top of its foreign policies priority, along with Canada, that I thank. Both countries that have also in priority in their foreign policies girls' education, which is another one of UNESCO's priority. Happy to be with you in the UK, a country where UNESCO's constitution was conceived in 1945, with a raison d'être inspired by the then Prime Minister Attlee to build the defense of peace in the minds of women and men. And today, with education, culture, and the sciences, the commitment to media freedom is one of the pillars of UNESCO's mission, and its implementation, one of the success highlighted in the latest performance assessment of the organization that was conducted by a group of member states, including the UK. The organization is leading the United Nations efforts to implement the first United Nations plan of action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. We do so with many other UN actors. This mission is being carried out on several fronts. First, by monitoring and raising awareness on the situation of journalists around the world. We condemned every murder. We call for investigation and prosecution, and we hold member states accountable. And above all, we make all this information public and available online. World Press Freedom Day, which UNESCO organizes every year in May, gathers the international community around media freedom, with more than 4,500 participants in the last edition, with the main conference that took place in Addis Ababa, one of the countries mentioned by Secretary of State as having undergone significant reforms in terms of media freedom. A country and an edition where our annual prize on media freedom was awarded to the Burmese journalists Waloni and Keo Sohu, released only a few days after. I hope you will all join us for the next edition of this World Press Freedom Day, which will be in the Netherlands next year. This work of reflections and awareness raising is also carried out on targeted topics like the harassment of women journalists. But UNESCO's work, above all, is preventive and normative. The organization has assisted some 50 countries to develop or reinforce legislative framework on media freedom and access to information. Very often countries in democratic transitions, like recently Tunisia and Cambodia, and I hope, Minister, we will be able to support Malaysia as well. We work on capacity building as well, providing the professionals with guides, for instance, the last one on fake news and disinformation that we published last year. But we also train non-media actors on media freedom from the judicial and security forces in order to support their understanding of international and national norms on freedom of expression. For instance, in Latin America, we've trained more than 10,000 professionals in our course since 2014. And lastly, we work in media education, but we could and should do much more on that front. And I look forward to do more in this field with the support of our partners, especially from the professional sector, publishers, broadcasters. But to be effective, this work needs to be supported and carried out on the field. And I want to thank all of those who work with us in civil societies, NGOs, professional organizations, the private sectors, journalism schools, experts. And all this wouldn't be possible without the support of our member states, also their financial support. And I would like to thank, among others, Canada, Italy, Norway, Sweden, Austria, Switzerland, the European Union. And I'm very pleased that UNESCO will host the new Global Media Defense Fund announced yesterday by the Secretary of State. It will help fund legal advice for journalists and safety training for those in conflict zone. And I joined Jeremy Hunt in inviting others to contribute to this initiative. This political will, these national commitments are essential to this global cause and also to multilateral work. We need more than ever multilateral, coherent, visible, and action-oriented strategy to strengthen media freedom and the safety of journalists. I thank you for your attention.
Very powerful words. Thank you, Audrey. And thank you for all the work that UNESCO are doing in this very, very important area, including your commitment to administer the new Global Media Defense Fund, which is going to be very, very significant. I'm now delighted to introduce my special envoy on media freedom, Amal Clooney. I got to know Amal when we worked together on the release of the two Reuters journalists, Walon and Chor Soo, when they were in prison in Burma. And she is a formidable advocate for journalists in trouble. And any journalist colleagues here, if you ever get into difficulty, I would warmly recommend her services if you can afford her fees. But we are working with Amal to convene an independent panel of experts to help strengthen legal protections for journalists across the world. So please give a warm hand for Amal Clooney.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be among so many distinguished guests today. When I addressed the conference yesterday, I noted that global media freedom has been in decline for over a decade, and we see evidence of this daily. In the last month alone, as we just heard from the UN, at least 3 journalists have been murdered, but also Myanmar's authorities blacked out the internet in Rakhine State, where the army has committed horrific abuses of Rohingyas. Sudan's military rulers shut down the internet to silence reporting of crimes committed against protesters. A journalist in Russia had drugs planted on him as revenge for his investigations. Chinese censors deleted reporting of the turmoil in Hong Kong, and Turkish prosecutors launched a criminal probe against Bloomberg reporters who Bloomberg said were reporting, quote, fairly and accurately on newsworthy events. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, a country of 200 million people, the authorities continued to literally mute TV news content they considered unfavorable, and even took the video feed of the main TV news program off the air. I spoke yesterday of one of my clients, Maria Ressa, a brave journalist and former bureau chief for CNN from the Philippines. She dared to criticize the actions of her president, and as a result has been the victim of every kind of government-sponsored harassment and persecution. She is attacked by online trolls who insult and threaten her in the vilest terms. The authorities tried to revoke the operating license of her news site, Repeal, and they have applied laws retroactively to criminalize her work. And the Justice Department in her country has now launched a succession of cases against her that threaten to bankrupt her and expose her to a maximum sentence of 63 years in prison. The current media crisis involves both the silencing of truth and the amplification of misinformation to levels we have never seen before. I believe that the way that the world responds to this crisis will define our generation and determine whether democracy can survive. So when the Foreign Secretary asked me to be the UK's Special Envoy on Media Freedom and to serve on a dedicated panel of legal experts, I agreed. In discussions with the Foreign Secretary, he made it clear that he wanted to establish a powerful new initiative that would create meaningful and lasting change, an initiative that would continue to operate regardless of which individual or political party was in power. He explained that the initiative would include the establishment of an independent and international panel of lawyers to advise governments on how they could better protect journalists and media freedom, and a media freedom fund to help journalists access legal advice and training in the field. I understood that the campaign was an opportunity for the UK and Canada to lead by example by supporting new initiatives to ensure that more robust international mechanisms would exist next time a journalist is arbitrarily detained or attacked. In these discussions, I set out my vision for the legal panel based on the issues that I think are the priorities for reform. The institution and consistent use of sanctions regimes to impose serious financial consequences on state officials who abuse media freedom. Enhanced consular duties when a journalist is detained abroad. A system of visas for persecuted journalists seeking asylum. An international investigative team that can be deployed, that includes lawyers and forensic experts and can be deployed when a journalist is attacked. And the promulgation of model legislation to guide states on the free speech guarantees that must be respected under international law. The legal panel will consider these issues and publish reports about what it believes can be done to better protect journalists and media freedom around the world. I am proud to say that the chairman of the panel is Lord Neuberger, the former president of this country's Supreme Court, and he has asked me to serve as his deputy chair. Together, we have sought to identify the leading international experts on media freedom from around the world, from a diverse group of legal backgrounds: judges, defense lawyers, academics, constitutional law experts, media specialists, and leading human rights practitioners. The panel includes a former Vice President of the European Court of Human Rights, a United States Federal Appeals Court judge, a former Constitutional Court judge from Colombia, the former Attorney General of Canada, leading barristers from the UK, academics from the US and Korea, and lawyers who are at the forefront of advocacy to promote media freedom around the world, including in Russia, India, Pakistan, Uganda, South Africa, and the Middle East. Today, although 173 states have ratified a United Nations treaty, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that guarantees freedom of speech, many countries still have laws that allow the muzzling of journalists. That includes laws criminalizing defamation, blasphemy, and sedition, and vague or overbroad laws on espionage, terrorism, fake news, public order, and hate speech that have been written or applied to silence dissent. I am proud to see the UK taking a leading role in the effort to review such laws, and it is right for it to do so. The UK is a UN Security Council permanent member that has traditionally supported international law and institutions. Many of the problematic laws that are being used to silence journalists around the world also came from British Commonwealth rule, and the UK has experience in reforming or abolishing these laws to bring its legislation in line with its modern values and international human rights norms. The UK's laws, for instance, used to criminalise blasphemy, and over 40 countries still do, including many former colonial states, and some states that still impose the death penalty for it. British law criminalising sedition was used in colonial India to prosecute Mahatma Gandhi, and the offence is still on the books today in the world's most populous democracy, as well as many other Commonwealth states, hopefully Malaysia not for long. Couldn't resist. By the time the UK officially repealed such laws just over 10 years ago, they had long ceased to be used in British courts, but many Britons were concerned about the impact such laws could have on the rest of the world. During debates about their repeal in Parliament in 2009, the Justice Minister observed that the existence of such obsolete laws in this country had been used by other countries to justify the retention of similar laws that were used to suppress political dissent and stifle press freedom. As a member of the House of Lords observed at the time, if our Parliament takes this step, it will be an example elsewhere. That legal reform initiative in the UK was ultimately successful after a campaign by British media organisations, civil society groups, parliamentarians and lawyers, and it can be a model for the international effort being launched today. Now, I know that some of you will be sceptical about an international campaign of this nature. I myself thought long and hard about whether this was likely to have impact or be just another conference establishing just another committee. But as I said yesterday, I believe that this campaign is important because the international system we have in place is broken. It is so broken that we have record levels of journalists being jailed and killed. It is so broken that people like Jamal Khashoggi can be murdered on foreign soil without any coordinated investigation, open trial, or effective accountability. So any new initiative that has the potential to move the needle in the right direction is worth considering. As Eleanor Roosevelt has said, universal human rights begin in small places, close to home. Without concerned citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. So I believe that each of us has a role to play. I believe it is the responsibility of journalists to do their job by engaging in fact-based reporting that values accuracy over speed or clicks. I believe that legislators and judges should ensure that their country's laws comply with the international standards that their governments have signed up to, and that such laws are not being abused to prosecute dissent. I believe that governments that respect press freedom should stand up to those that don't, by imposing real-world consequences on officials who abuse human rights. For my part, I will work with my colleagues on the legal panel to research and produce recommendations for change. We shall seek advice from civil society, academia, and the legal profession where necessary, and we will consult with journalists on what they think is needed to keep them safe. And when the time is right, I will report honestly on whether states are listening. The world is upside down when those who commit the worst abuses are free, while those who report on them are not. And if we don't turn things around, democracy cannot survive. The global decline in press freedom has been hastened by rhetoric from the leader of the world's most powerful democracy, and it will not be reversed without strong leadership from others. I thank the governments of the UK and Canada for bringing us together today. I celebrate the opportunity that this gathering represents, and I hope that we will look back on this day as the beginning of an era of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Amal, who has consistently, since her involvement in the organisation of this conference, been keen to make sure that there are real teeth to any changes that we advocate and that this is not just a talking shop. And in order to allow you guys to hold us to account on this, and you're pretty good at holding politicians to account anyway, we're going to have another conference next year in Canada, hosted by Chrystia Freeland, which I hope to attend, obviously as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And that is the right moment for me to introduce Chrystia, who is, as everyone knows, the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and was herself a journalist, where she worked for the Financial Times, the Globe and the Mail, worked for the Financial Times in Moscow. And she has been a great inspiration to me as a fellow foreign minister. She has championed more than any foreign minister I've come across a values-based approach to foreign policy, which I think is really important. But as someone who herself covered the first war in Chechnya in the 1990s, she understands about the safety of journalists and the power of independent journalism. And I think she probably knows more about that than anyone in politics today. So, Chrystia.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, for that extremely kind introduction. We do have an election coming up in Canada, and I think I might need to invite Jeremy to come out and introduce me to some of our voters. That was very nice of you. And I do want to thank you, Jeremy, for having the very important idea of hosting this conference. I think all of us, as Amal was honest enough to admit, faced some skepticism in doing this. There is a bit of milk and motherhood feeling to it, but it is incredibly important, and I'm so grateful to you for having the idea and for following through, for inviting Canada to work with you. And I do want to thank the magnificent British team of public servants who have done just a fantastic job in bringing this to life. You guys are a terrific model public service. Yes, Minister is not entirely untrue, and all of us depend on our public servants. And I do also want to thank Amal for her great comments and her great work. In every newsroom I worked in as a reporter, an adage was that the better the journalist was, the even better the lawyer needed to be. So this autumn, we will celebrate the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. For those of us who lived through that time, as I did, my kids can't believe I'm that old, it was a euphoric moment, and one when it was tempting to imagine that liberal democracy was both inevitable and eternal. That was such a seductive idea, but it has proven to be an illusory one. Instead, it is clear today that liberal democracy and the rules-based international order are under greater threat than at any time since the Second World War. As Robert Kagan argues in his recent book, if the liberal order is like a garden, artificial and forever threatened by the forces of nature, preserving it requires a persistent, unending struggle against the vines and weeds that are constantly working to undermine it from within and overwhelm it from without. Today, there are signs all around us that the jungle is growing back. I agree with that so profoundly. And there is no part of our liberal democratic garden which is more threatened by the jungle's resurgence than the free press. The danger is often specific and physical. Beaucoup d'entre vous ont probablement
Many of you have probably already, in fact, realized that this, have seen the number of journalists that have lost their lives over the last few years. So let's just remember them for a minute, and let us also salute their courage, because the troubling reality, as was explained in detail during meetings today and yesterday, and that the journalists and workers in the media are more and more targeted and are more and more abused and attacked. And this must stop. We have to work together in order to ensure that journalists can carry out their work in all safety and without any kind of worry for reprisals.
we have been hearing yesterday and today is that journalists and other members of the media are increasingly the targets of abuse and attack. That must stop. Journalists must be able to do their work safely and without fear of reprisal. Now, I'd like to pause and address the elephant in the room. The seeming paradox of elected politicians coming together to support a free press. We politicians may seem to be surprising champions for the media, and that's because of the inherent structural conflict between the press and the government. The job of journalists, after all, is to hold our feet to the fire. And as someone who is regularly on the receiving end of that treatment, I can assure you that it is not a very pleasant experience. And I'm sure all the politicians in this room are nodding in hearty agreement. But it would be a terrible mistake for any politician, smarting perhaps from that discomfort, to conclude that journalists are the enemy. Quite the contrary. A free and independent media, in all of its disputatious, cantankerous glory, is one of the cornerstones of liberal democracy. Reminding ourselves and each other of that fundamental reality is why it is so useful for us to come together today. Now, the truth is, to be sure, that it's harder to be a politician, to be a government in a country with a free and independent media. But that's the point. By holding us, their governments, accountable, journalists make us better than we would otherwise be. Facts matter. Truth matters. Competence and honesty among elected leaders and in our public services matter. Now, these assertions may seem so obvious as to be trite, but the objective of the world's rising authoritarianism is to undermine the very idea of objective facts, of objective truth. We need to fight back. As Mariana Katsarova so memorably and movingly said yesterday, quoting her dear friend, the assassinated Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, what matters is the information and not what you think about it. Anna's tragic death reminds us that Russia is one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists to work today. And that, by the way, is not an accident. It's quite deliberate. Now, Anna's wonderful defense of the truth echoed a great line, one of my favorites about journalism, from Guardian editor C.P. Scott. Nearly a century ago, he said, "Comment is free, but facts are sacred." These are lofty words and important ones. One of the things Jeremy and I hope to do with this conference is to buttress these essential, important ideas with some specific collective and practical steps. The first is the Global Pledge for Media Freedom. We must seek accountability for crimes against journalists. That is why Canada has used sanctions as a tool to address abuses of media freedom. Following the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, Canada imposed sanctions on 17 people. As an extension of the pledge, we are also launching a media freedom coalition that will connect governments with civil society organizations and members of the press to save journalists and media workers at risk. This coalition and the Media Freedom Contact Group is a cousin to the Rapid Response Mechanism launched during Canada's G7 presidency last year to address malign disinformation. On World Press Freedom Day, which Audrey described to us, this year, Canada announced $12 million for the organization Journalists for Human Rights. Today, I'm announcing another $10 million annually to promote and protect democracy. This funding will focus on supporting electoral processes, reinforcing democratic practices by combating disinformation, and strengthening civic engagement. An initial $1 million will go to the new Global Media Defense Fund housed at UNESCO that Audrey has talked to us about. And of course, as Amal has just described, we are launching the independent panel of legal experts to support and advance media freedom worldwide. Canada is very excited by this work, and we are delighted that our own Irwin Cotler, a distinguished Canadian human rights lawyer and former Minister of Justice, and I would say my personal conscience, if he feels we are lagging on the human rights front, Irwin is very quick to phone or email me, will be serving on the panel. I outline these actions not as an exhaustive list, but as examples of some first concrete steps we can take together. Canada has been delighted to co-host this year's Media Freedom Conference with the UK, and we are honoured to serve as next year's host. And we look forward to you being with us in Canada, Jeremy. Listening to the testimonies of the brave and brilliant journalists gathered here, it was easy for me yesterday to be scared or, frankly, to get depressed. But let's choose instead to be inspired. Let's be inspired by Anas Aramayo Anas from Ghana, who spoke to us yesterday from behind a curtain of beads because he would be in danger if he exposed his face. Let's be inspired by Luz Meli Reyes of Venezuela, who, together with her colleagues, decided, as she so eloquently put it, not to wait for her own funeral, but instead to create some fireflies to help light up the darkness of the Maduro dictatorship. We all need to defend our independent press, even and perhaps especially when it criticizes us as a central institution of democracy. We need to fight for the open society against the closed one. We need to fight for the complexity of democratic truth rather than the beguiling simplicity of authoritarian rhetoric. Then and only then will we have weeded our democratic garden and will we have kept the jungle from growing back. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christia, for those very inspiring words and for your support and Canada's support for this conference. Now we're going to hear from the BBC. Slightly bittersweet moment for me because as a UK politician, I find their coverage of the arguments I put forward totally infuriating, but that is, of course, their job, and I am very proud of what the BBC stands for across the world. Indeed, if I was trying to explain to anyone what a free media means to our society in the UK, I would tell them to watch Question Time or the Andrew Marr Show or listen to the Today programme, not of course when I'm being interviewed, but I think that we can be very proud of what the BBC stands for. And so with great pleasure can I introduce Tony Hall, the Director General.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to both the UK government and the Canadian government for hosting this really, really important conference. At the BBC, there's a quotation that our journalists, and indeed I, walk past every morning. It's there in front of us near our broadcasting house, and many of you may know it. I think it was mentioned yesterday. It's a statue of George Orwell, and the quote from him is carved into the wall outside New Broadcasting House, and it says, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." It's a daily reminder of what good journalism must do: speak truth to power on behalf of our audiences and our citizens. And for journalists, there is no more important issue than the ability to report without fear of reprisal. But as we've heard throughout this conference, and indeed just now this morning, reporting the news has never been more dangerous. More journalists are losing their lives than at any time I can remember just for doing their job. And I'm so pleased to be sharing this platform with those who are so determined to protect journalists worldwide and who believe so passionately in media freedom. There are 3 points I want to make today, speaking really as the editor-in-chief of the BBC, a major journalistic organisation. And the first is this, and we've heard a lot most lately from Amal about the threats we face as journalists, which are becoming even more insidious. I have highlighted many times the case of our BBC Persian staff who, along with their families, continue to be harassed and persecuted by the Iranian authorities. And I want to pay tribute again to their resilience, of them and their families, in the face of years of concerted intimidation. The reality is that our staff are now facing growing intimidation and interference worldwide. Last year in Nigeria, a BBC investigation looked into an epidemic of codeine cough syrup abuse and the vast criminal network behind it. It caused a change in the law right away, and the codeine addiction rate plummeted. But the severe threats our journalists faced to their physical security have intensified. In Uganda in February, a team investigating the illegal sale of government medicines was arrested and then released on bond. Our reporter in Kampala later heard of a plan to arrest her in connection with the investigation, was forced to go into hiding. Earlier this year in Burundi, we aired a documentary about secret detention and torture sites. The result, BBC was banned. In China, the World Service moved its sites to a secure internet protocol last July. The result, all BBC websites have been blocked ever since. And closer to home, our Istanbul correspondent puts it this way: to commit the act of journalism in today's Turkey requires a thick skin and a good lawyer. Increasingly, our people, as we've heard, are being targeted for telling the truth by those who believe they should either have editorial control of how we report, or that they can stop us reporting altogether. At the start of this week, we published the BBC's editorial guidelines, the values and standards that apply to all our staff worldwide. And they explicitly include freedom of expression for the very first time. Not because we haven't always upheld it as an essential value, but because in today's news climate, we can no longer take anything for granted. Our values matter. We have to speak loudly about them. Which leads me to the second point I want to make today. We need to reassert those core principles of good journalism like never before. In a sea of disinformation and partisan reporting, we need to stand up for independence, for impartiality, and reporting without fear or favour. What does this mean for us? What does it mean for anyone who cares about good journalism? I believe it means boots on the ground, first-hand, on-the-spot reporting from the front line. It means an even greater focus on specialism, experts in their field who can interpret the facts and offer trusted judgments, who know what they're talking about. And it means doing more to empower our audiences by giving them more context and more explanation to understand what's going on. Not just the what, but the why. And I want to give you one example. It comes from a programme we've launched recently called Africa Eye, and it's an investigative programme which we launched last year to help hold power to account across the African continent. And it looked into a horrifying video that began circulating on social media last year. And some of you might have seen it. It showed two women and two young children The children are strapped to the back of the women, being led away at gunpoint by a group of Cameroonian soldiers and then murdered, shot. The government of Cameroon initially dismissed the video as fake news, and many claimed it took place elsewhere. But the BBC team painstakingly went through the footage and proved otherwise. They used satellite imagery to identify the mountain ridgeline that could be seen in the background of the footage. They identified the tracks, the buildings, the exact location. They used the evidence of the dry season and the soldiers' shadows in that season to pin down the date to within a 2-week period. And they also used extensive open source research to disprove official claims about the guns and the uniforms of the soldiers. They even managed to identify 3 of those who pulled the trigger by name. And that, to me, is a tribute to the power of old-fashioned journalistic values on the one hand, combined with cutting-edge techniques on the other, and also giving teams the time and money they need for world-class investigations. And my third point is this. As well as reasserting our values, we face another existential challenge, and we've heard a lot about it this morning. Trust in journalism is being undermined by misinformation, and that's why we need to take the fight directly to misinformation or fake news. We have to remind ourselves what's at stake. An assault on truth is an assault on democracy, because a democracy that cannot rely on access to the truth is in reality no democracy at all. We saw in the Nigerian elections in February the extent to which disinformation can now disrupt the debate. During the recent elections in India, our BBC teams focused on calling out fake news stories spread deliberately for political gain, and that won us audiences. But it also highlighted how frequently disinformation can now spark violence and even cause loss of life. Last year alone, the BBC identified around 25 deaths by lynch mobs following rumours spread on social media or messaging apps. Many more were reported. And we're now in the midst of the biggest assault on truth, and therefore democracy, since, in my view, the 1930s. Bad actors and repressive regimes have not only weaponized misinformation, some have industrialized its production and packaged it for a global audience. All those who believe in integrity in news must together turn the tide. Last month, I convened what we called a Trusted News Summit at the BBC, which was behind closed doors and brought together global tech platforms and publishers, people who believe in what we've been talking about over the last two days. And the goal was to arrive at a practical set of actions we could take together to tackle the rise of misinformation and bias. And we're going to speak more about that in the weeks ahead. But what struck me so powerfully was so many people looking to the convening power that we may have at the BBC to bring people together for this issue. And I believe we have a major responsibility as a well-trusted brand around the world to do just that. Our global audiences have grown 13% in just 1 year to 426 million people each week. Largely thanks, I have to say, to the UK government and its recognition of the part we can play in achieving common goals. But I am determined that we use, with others, with partners, that unique reach and trusted voice to lead the way, to create a global alliance for integrity in news. We're ready to do even more to help promote freedom of expression worldwide. We want to play our part to the full at the heart of this critical campaign. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for those fascinating comments and for all the work the BBC does. We're just going to wrap up with two brief contributions from the floor, brief but important contributions. So first of all, can I invite Christophe Deloire, the Secretary-General of Reporters Without Borders.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. As you mentioned, there are very amazing exceptions, but globally speaking, the World Press Freedom Map that is derived from the World Press Freedom Index that Reporters Without Borders publishes is getting darker. Guess how many people, what's the percentage of the world's population that lives in a country that is either black or red on this map. That's to say, a country where the situation of press freedom is either there is no press freedom or very difficult. 74%. What's the percentage of the population that lives in a country which is either colored white or yellow on the map? 9%. 9% only. We are at a tipping point. There is a huge risk that countermodels take the lead. Business as usual could kill democracies. Foreign Secretary, you announced yesterday that you would establish an international task force to help governments to deliver their commitments on press freedom. To manage this, RSF believes that a special representative to the UN Secretary General on the protection of journalists is needed. I would like to thank all the members of the coalition that advocates for this, the governments that already defended this project, and we would like both the UK and Canada to take more concrete actions to make it happen. Foreign Secretary, you also announced yesterday that you would bring together a contact group of like-minded countries to lobby in unison. Of course, we welcome this idea. We welcome this idea, of course, on the condition that it is not just a formal mechanism, that you can get quick results. Quick results even on the most sensitive cases, and even sometimes in democracies. On Raif Badawi, this blogger in Saudi Arabia. On the Cumhuriyet journalists in Turkey. Regarding also the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. And I will also say that the case of Julian Assange, his persecution, has huge implications for press freedom in the US and potentially in other countries. We challenge every state in this room to select cases of impunity for crimes against journalists and achieve results. Use your political weight to get those results, to get justice. Use your leverage to get a release, and then it will snowball. Otherwise, in the future, democratic governments could find themselves like isolated in the international summits. Should we accept that even the G20 becomes like a club of press freedom predators? With, of course, exceptions, but if we have a look on the list, it can be worrying. We have to take our responsibility also as NGOs. If needed, to amend our tactics, to renew our naming and shaming strategies, to directly engage with governments, as we did as Reporters Without Borders recently with Saudi Arabia, when we organized an unprecedented mission to this country to try to get the release of more than 30 journalists who are arbitrarily detained in this country. We also have to work on positive safeguards for the pluralism, for independence, freedom, and, as you mentioned, trustworthiness of news and information. Journalism is also about trustworthiness, not just about expression. That's why, as Reporters Without Borders, we launched the Journalism Trust Initiative, and I would like to take this occasion to thank Audrey Azoulay for the involvement of UNESCO and also Tony Hall, because the BBC is also part of it. We have 120 entities. That's why also we launched the Information and Democracy Initiative, and we were very glad yesterday to hear during this conference that the UK would be part of it in the future. We have some reasons to be optimistic. As you said, Minister, we have absolutely to avoid to live in a jungle, because in the jungle, predators always win. Thank you.
Thank you, Christophe. And the final contribution from the floor is Peter Grest, who is a distinguished journalist who has covered the Middle East for Al Jazeera. Where's Peter?
Foreign Secretary, I'm here.
You're there. Hi, Peter.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to make this intervention. As many people know, and as Amal was in a case that Amal was involved in, I was one of 3 Al Jazeera journalists imprisoned in Egypt through 2013 and 2014. And one of the things I'd like to point out is that this idea of press freedom can often feel like an abstraction, particularly for those of us who live in democratic states. What happened to us, I think, hit the headlines, particularly because we came to represent what a loss of press freedom actually looks like, in a way that was very tangible. Those images of us behind the cage in Egypt was something that so many people could identify with. And I applaud the Foreign Secretary and both Canada and Australia the United Kingdom for organising this conference. It is vitally important, but there are a number of things that a number of points that I'd like to make. First of all, again, I would also like to commend you for the initiatives that have been announced today, particularly the ones that Mal discussed. But there are a number of things that I would like to urge any country that claims to be a defender of press freedom, that claims to believe in it. A number of statistics have been thrown around many times. The impunity of journalists is 90%. 9 out of 10 murders of journalists are uninvestigated and unpunished. There are more than 300 journalists currently in prison. Daily, journalists are harassed and intimidated and threatened and abused. Any country that truly believes in these ideas can and should deal with all of those issues today. Journalists imprisoned can be released today. These are things that politicians can achieve immediately. Impunity can be ended immediately. Investigations can and should be begun. 90% of unsolved cases is simply unacceptable anywhere in the world. Foreign Secretary, one of the things that you said in your introductory remarks was that you said that there is often a trade-off, a tension. There is a necessary tension between journalism and national security. And I'd like to disagree politely with you on that front, because I believe that if national security means anything, it is about, yes, protecting the physical security and integrity and safety of individuals within our countries, but it is also surely about protecting the fundamental integrity of the system, the democratic systems that have worked so effectively to make our states some of the freest, most stable and prosperous places on the planet. So if in trying to protect individuals, we fundamentally end up undermining one of the principles of our democracy, one of those fundamental pillars of our democracy, then surely national security is not served. I would also like to, again, reflect on what Tony Hall mentioned, and that is the responsibility of journalists to improve our own gains, to lift our standards, to regain much of the public trust which we have lost over the years. But I would also like our politicians to seriously reconsider the fundamental digital environment that prioritizes, that rewards rumour over fact, speed over accuracy, polemic over analysis. It is incredibly difficult for journalists to function effectively in an environment that promotes and prioritises that kind of coverage. And we need to seriously reconsider that environment if we're going to be serious about tackling press freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude. It seems everyone here is very fond of quotes. So I would like to conclude by quoting the French philosopher Albert Camus, who said that a free press can, of course, be both good and bad, but a press that is not free can never be anything but bad. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everyone for their excellent contributions, and I don't want you to allow me to get away with not responding to some of the comments that have been made. So I just want to make a brief comment, Peter, about what you said about the issue of trade-offs. It's possible to have conflicting objectives that are both right. the objective of justice and the objective of mercy, as Isaiah Berlin once talked about. And I think the purpose of this conference is to point out that freedom and media freedom, which is essential to it, has to be one of our central objectives, however much we look at all the other objectives. And we have to be very careful that we don't trade away something that is absolutely fundamental to our belief as to what it is that allows humanity to flourish. And to go back to what Christophe said, I think it's very important that democratic governments do not treat support for media freedom as about virtue signalling, and that they are prepared to take practical actions. But I'm afraid I would respectfully disagree with you that there are always quick solutions to these problems. It took a very long time to get the Reuters journalists out of Burma. There was an enormous amount of private diplomacy as well as public diplomacy, and we don't control the laws in other countries. So sometimes these things are difficult to solve, and the question is whether you are actually trying. And I think what we've got here is 1,500 people who are going to hold politicians like me and Christia to account as to whether we're actually trying. And I think you guys are well smart enough to tell the difference between looking like you're trying and really trying. And we'll see you next year in Canada, and you can tell us what you think. Thank you all very much indeed.